March 17, 1943, the day German spies knew the war was lost. Part 1, A Paper Bomb in Berlin. On the morning of March 17, 1943, in a quiet, wood-paneled office in Berlin, a German admiral held in his hand a single sheet of paper that seemed impossible. It wasn't a blueprint for a secret weapon. It wasn't an intercepted plan for a surprise invasion. It was just a summary of raw intelligence, one page. But its contents were more devastating than a 1,000-pound bomb. The report described no superweapon, no wonder army. It described something far more dangerous, an American factory. An industrial colossus, thousands of miles away across the Atlantic, that was projected to soon be capable of producing a 4-engine heavy bomber every 60 minutes. To the men of the German High Command, it read like a joke, a clumsy piece of American propaganda, an absurd claim so laughable that it could be dismissed with a sneer. But to the spies who had risked their lives gathering the information, it was something else entirely. It was a death sentence written in numbers. Because on that day, March 17, 1943, they knew, with chilling certainty, that the war was already lost. This is the story of the truth that was too terrifying for Adolf Hitler to believe, and how the denial of a single fact sealed the fate of the Third Reich. A strange admiral in the heart of the Reich. At the center of this revelation stood Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence. Canaris was an anomaly within Hitler's war machine. Unlike the fanatics and ideologues who filled the Führer's inner circle, he was an old-school naval officer, a professional who lived by cold, hard facts. To him, loyalty to Germany meant providing unvarnished truth, no matter how unpleasant. Where others saw the war through the distorted lens of Nazi ideology, Canaris looked through the clear glass of strategic reality. The Abwehr, under his leadership, was a sprawling global network of agents, informants, and analysts. In the early years of the war, it had been essential to the Blitzkrieg successes, delivering intelligence that allowed the Wehrmacht to outmaneuver its enemies. But by early 1943, the tide was shifting. The shocking defeat at Stalingrad had shattered the myth of German invincibility. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet war machine was rolling forward with terrifying momentum. In North Africa, British and American forces were suffocating Rommel's Afrika Korps. For the first time, Germany's future looked uncertain. And yet, at the very top, in Hitler's fortified Wolf's Lair headquarters, a dangerous sense of invincibility lingered. Surrounded by sycophants who filtered out bad news, Hitler increasingly believed that victory was a matter of sheer willpower. German soldiers were superior. German science unbeatable. Victory was destiny. Into this echo chamber of arrogance and self-deception, Admiral Canaris was about to drop an ice-cold dose of reality. Numbers that terrified. Canaris knew the brutal truth of modern war. It wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a clash of economies. A merciless equation of steel, oil, and aluminum. And through his network of agents, he began seeing numbers that terrified him. The intelligence didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, whispers from all corners of the globe. A businessman returning from the United States spoke of a factory so large it seemed to generate its own weather. A diplomat in Washington reported on production targets that looked as though someone had accidentally added an extra zero. A Swedish engineer transmitted a coded message about an aircraft assembly line that moved with the speed of automobile manufacturing. Individually, these reports seemed unbelievable. But together, they formed a chilling pattern. Every report pointed to one place, a massive industrial complex in Michigan called Willow Run. The claims seemed ridiculous. The Ford Motor Company was applying its automobile mass production techniques to one of the most complex machines of war, the B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. And their goal? Not one bomber a day, not one every few hours, but one every single hour. To the German mind, this was absurd, impossible, insulting. The impossible truth, a bomber every hour. The B-24 Liberator was no ordinary aircraft. It was a beast of war, an 18-ton giant made of aluminum and steel, containing over 1.5 million individual parts. To produce one required staggering precision, coordination, and time. In German factories, celebrated as pinnacles of European engineering, building a comparable heavy bomber, like the Heinkel He-177, often took weeks or even months. It was a process driven by craftsmen, not mass production. And yet, American intelligence reports insisted that across the ocean, a single factory was preparing to do the impossible, produce one of these massive machines every 60 minutes. A calculation of doom. For Canaris and his analysts, this wasn't just another intelligence rumor. It was arithmetic. If the Americans could achieve their goal, Willow Run would produce 24 bombers per day, over 700 each month, from one plant alone. At the time, Germany's entire aircraft industry was struggling to produce even a fraction of that figure across all its factories combined. And the reports were corroborated. Japanese naval attaches in Washington, Germany's own allies, were sending back production figures with a tone of dread. Swedish engineers confirmed details. Businessmen and diplomats, too. The data came from different sources, but told the same story. The evidence was overwhelming. And yet, it was incomprehensible to the German leadership. An ideological blind spot. How could it be possible? How could a nation that Nazi propaganda mocked as a chaotic, racially mixed, undisciplined society build such weapons with terrifying efficiency? How could women, African Americans, immigrants, and so-called inferior people contribute to the construction of such advanced war machines? In the Nazi worldview, it was absurd. A messy democracy couldn't possibly mobilize with such unity and focus. A diverse workforce couldn't possibly match the disciplined master race. Therefore, the reports had to be false. They must be part of a massive American deception campaign. The alternative, that America's factories were about to bury the Reich under an avalanche of steel and aluminum, was simply too horrific to accept. The industrial monster in Michigan. But half a world away, the impossible was becoming reality. On a vast stretch of farmland in Michigan, an industrial monster had risen, the Willow Run bomber plant. It was the physical embodiment of what President Franklin Roosevelt had called the arsenal of democracy. Designed by the great industrial architect Albert Kahn, Willow Run was a factory unlike anything the world had ever seen. Its main building stretched over half a mile, so vast it was described as the largest room in the history of mankind. To avoid paying taxes in 2 different counties, the assembly line had to make a bizarre 90-degree turn, forcing bombers in progress to rotate on massive turntables. Workers jokingly called it the tax turn. But the size of the building wasn't the true revolution. It was the philosophy inside. Henry Ford's gamble. Henry Ford and his production chief, Charles Sorensen, made an audacious promise. They would build airplanes just as they had built Model T automobiles. The traditional aviation industry scoffed. "You can't expect a blacksmith to build a watch overnight," one executive sneered. Ford disagreed. He broke down the B-24 into smaller subassemblies, designed tools and jigs for repetitive tasks, and trained workers for single, specialized operations. One worker drilled holes all day. Another riveted panels. Another wired electrical harnesses. This assembly line system turned raw recruits into efficient specialists within days. It allowed the factory's apprentice school to churn out thousands of new workers every week. And those workers? They represented everything Nazi ideology despised. Contradicting Nazi ideology, the workforce of Willow Run. At its peak, the Willow Run bomber plant employed more than 42,000 workers. Nearly a third of them were women. These women, immortalized as Rosie the Riveters, wielded rivet guns, welding torches, and drills with a speed and precision that astonished seasoned engineers. One of them, Roswell Monroe, even became the living model for the iconic Rosie in wartime propaganda posters. The plant's workforce was a living contradiction to Nazi ideology. Women who had never set foot in a factory before learned to assemble some of the most advanced aircraft of the war. African Americans, making up nearly 10% of the workforce, worked side by side with white colleagues in roles that directly challenged Jim Crow segregation back home. Immigrants and the disabled, too, played essential roles, filling shifts around the clock. This chaotic, diverse workforce, mocked by Nazi propaganda as weak and mongrel, was proving more efficient than Germany's racially pure workforce. Around-the-clock production. The scale of the effort was staggering. Willow Run ran 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. The noise of drills, hammers, and engines never stopped. Conveyor belts carried parts from one end of the massive plant to the other. Subassemblies merged like streams feeding a river. Raw aluminum, steel, and rubber entered one side of the building. On the other side, an 18-ton B-24 heavy bomber rolled out, ready to fly. The process wasn't smooth at first. In its early days, workers jokingly called the plant "Will It Run" because so many aircraft came off the line with defects. But by mid-1943, the system had hit its stride. The plant's rhythm became relentless. The humming of machines, the clatter of rivet guns, the thundering test engines, it was the sound of industrial warfare. The arsenal of democracy. This was no longer propaganda. It was a new form of warfare, war by assembly line. While German scientists poured resources into futuristic wonder weapons that promised miracles but delivered little, America had discovered its most devastating weapon of all, the power of mass production. Every bomber rolling out of Willow Run represented not just firepower in the skies, but also the triumph of an idea, that a free and diverse society, when united, could outproduce and overwhelm even the most rigid authoritarian state. And yet, back in Berlin, when Admiral Canaris tried to sound the alarm, he faced a wall of denial. Hitler's denial, facts versus ideology. Armed with the intelligence, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris prepared to confront the German leadership with the grim arithmetic of war. The numbers were clear. They had been vetted, cross-checked, even confirmed by Japan's own military attaches. The conclusion was unavoidable. If America could produce bombers at this scale, Germany's defeat was only a matter of time. But in Berlin, facts had little value. Göring's laughter. The first line of defense against reality was Reich's Marshal Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe. A decorated World War I ace turned corrupt politician, Göring considered himself the ultimate authority on air power. When Canaris presented the Abwehr's findings, Göring didn't respond with alarm. He laughed. Americans cannot build airplanes, he sneered. They're very good at refrigerators and razor blades. It was more than a throwaway insult. It perfectly summarized the Nazi worldview. Americans were a consumer society, a mongrel nation of shopkeepers and tinkerers. They lacked the discipline, purity, and martial spirit of the German people. The idea that such a culture could mass-produce heavy bombers was, to Göring, simply impossible. To accept the reports would mean admitting that the Luftwaffe was already outmatched and that his leadership had missed the most critical development of the war. For a man of Göring's ego, that was unthinkable. The Führer's wall of delusion. If Göring dismissed the reports with arrogance, Adolf Hitler met them with venom. Inside the Führer's headquarters, whether the mountain retreat at Berghof or the fortified Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, reality was whatever Hitler declared it to be. Briefings were not about facts or strategy. They were performances designed to reinforce his convictions. When confronted with the Willow Run figures, one bomber every hour, more than 650 a month, Hitler erupted. This wasn't just military intelligence to him. It was a personal insult to his worldview. The numbers weren't evidence. They were Jewish propaganda, inflated fantasies designed to demoralize Germany. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister and one of the few men who actually understood production, later admitted under Allied interrogation that he recognized the report's terrifying implications. But in 1943, to voice such an opinion in Hitler's presence was political suicide. So the truth was buried. A fatal choice. In that moment, fact gave way to dogma. The Abwehr's intelligence wasn't just ignored, it was treated as defeatism, even treachery. The men who brought the warning had their loyalty questioned. In Hitler's mind, wars were not won with aluminum and assembly lines. They were won with willpower, blood, and racial destiny. The single sheet of paper that landed on Canaris's desk in March 1943 contained the most important strategic fact of the war, but was brushed aside, dismissed by men too arrogant, too blind, or too afraid to face it. And with that denial, the fate of a Reich was sealed. The avalanche of bombers. The intelligence Canaris had tried to force into the Reich's consciousness did not remain theory for long. By late 1943, the numbers he presented on paper had become steel and fire in the skies over Germany. What began as a trickle of Allied bombers quickly swelled into a relentless flood. The skies darkened. In February 1944, the Allies launched Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. Its goal was brutally simple: cripple the German aircraft industry once and for all. Thousands of bombers thundered across the skies of Europe. Among them were the very machines that Willow Run had been designed to churn out, the B-24 Liberators. Day after day, wave after wave, they struck aircraft factories, ball bearing plants, and oil refineries. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them in desperate combat, but the outcome was inevitable. For every German fighter that went down, replacements trickled off assembly lines. For every American bomber destroyed, 10 more were already crossing the Atlantic. The war of attrition. This was the grim equation Canaris had foreseen. A war not of spirit, but of attrition. A war decided by numbers. German pilots fought with bravery, skill, and often suicidal determination. But bravery could not compete with mathematics. The Luftwaffe was being annihilated. By the summer of 1944, its strength had been shattered. Entire bomber formations flew deep into Germany with little effective resistance. The cities that Göring once promised would never be bombed were being reduced to rubble. Factories collapsed in flames. Railroads were torn apart. Oil, the lifeblood of modern mechanized war, dried up. The unstoppable Wehrmacht began to seize up, not because its soldiers lacked courage, but because its tanks, planes, and trucks had no fuel. Prophecy fulfilled. The B-24s rolling off Willow Run's mile-long assembly line were no longer rumors or propaganda. They were reality, swarming across German skies, blotting out the sun, dismantling the Reich piece by piece. The single sheet of paper that Berlin had laughed at in March 1943 had become a prophecy fulfilled in fire and steel. And the cost of ignoring it was nothing less than the destruction of the Third Reich's war machine. The price of truth, Admiral Canaris's fate. For Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the price of truth was ruin. His insistence on presenting cold facts, facts that contradicted Hitler's fantasies, had already made him suspect in the Führer's paranoid court. By 1943, anyone who spoke of limits, shortages, or defeat was branded a defeatist, or worse, a traitor. Canaris had become both indispensable and distrusted. His Abwehr agents brought in excellent intelligence, yet their accuracy only deepened Hitler's suspicions. Reality itself was treated as sabotage, a dangerous double life. But Canaris's peril did not stop with his reports on American production. Privately, he was horrified by SS atrocities. He quietly used the Abwehr to shield members of the German resistance. He helped theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who opposed the regime, and worked behind the scenes to keep Spain from formally joining the Axis, a move that denied Hitler vital access to the Mediterranean. These actions, invisible at the time, would later prove decisive. But in 1943-44, they marked Canaris as a man out of step with the Nazi state. The July 20th plot. The end came after July 20, 1944, when a bomb planted by German officers failed to kill Adolf Hitler. The Gestapo unleashed a ruthless investigation into the conspirators. The trail led, inevitably, to the Abwehr. Canaris's personal diaries were discovered, revealing his deep opposition to Hitler and his regime. It was damning evidence. The admiral was arrested. A brutal end. In April 1945, as the Reich collapsed in fire and ruin, Canaris's fate was sealed. On Hitler's direct orders, he was executed at Flossenburg concentration camp. He was stripped naked, humiliated, and strangled with piano wire, a slow, agonizing death meant as both punishment and spectacle. It was a brutal end for the man who had seen the truth with perfect clarity, the man who had tried to save Germany from its own blindness. His crime was not betrayal of his country, but betrayal of the lie that sustained the regime. For that, he was erased. The final tally, numbers that buried the Reich. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the arithmetic that Admiral Canaris had tried to hammer into Hitler's circle finally revealed its crushing weight. The single page of intelligence that arrived on his desk in March 1943 had not been exaggerated. If anything, it had understated the reality. Willow Run's legacy. At its peak in 1944, Willow Run achieved the impossible. A brand new B-24 Liberator rolled off the line every 63 minutes. By the time the last aircraft emerged from Michigan plant, the Ford Motor Company had produced 6,972 complete B-24s there, plus another 1,893 knockdown kits for final assembly elsewhere. Think about that. A single American factory built more four-engine heavy bombers than the entire German aircraft industry managed across the whole war. America's avalanche of production. And Willow Run was only one part of the American machine. Across all facilities, the United States built more than 18,400 B-24 Liberators, making it the most produced heavy bomber in history. Between 1940 and 1945, American factories turned out over 300,000 military aircraft of all types. Germany, in the same span, produced roughly 94,000 combat aircraft, barely a third. The scale was beyond comparison. It wasn't even a contest. As industrialist William S. Knudsen put it, "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production the like of which he had never seen nor dreamed possible." A failure of belief. This outcome was not the result of failed espionage. German spies had done their jobs. They had uncovered the truth. They had delivered it. The failure was one of belief. The Nazi leadership, blinded by arrogance and ideology, simply refused to accept the facts. They trusted their prejudices more than their intelligence reports. And so Germany was not defeated by a miracle weapon, but by simple mathematics, by the steady hum of assembly lines, by the relentless logic of mass production, by the reality they had mocked as propaganda. The power of facts over fantasy. The story of March 17, 1943 is more than a fascinating footnote in World War II. It is a lesson in how wars and civilizations are won and lost. In a quiet Berlin office, German intelligence officers discovered the truth of America's industrial power. They saw clearly that the war had become a contest of production, one that Germany could not possibly win. But the truth was ignored, even ridiculed, by leaders who chose to believe in ideology over evidence. That failure of acceptance sealed the fate of millions. Blinded by mythology. The Nazi regime had built its worldview on myths, myths of racial purity, myths of destiny, myths of German invincibility. When faced with cold arithmetic that contradicted those myths, the leadership simply rejected reality. Numbers were brushed aside as lies, and the men who reported them were branded as weak or treasonous. In the end, the Reich was not defeated by lack of information, but by lack of imagination, by its inability to conceive that a free, diverse, and mongrel society could outbuild and outfight the so-called master race. Willow Run's true legacy. The Willow Run factory became a monument to everything Nazism despised. Women operating heavy machinery. African Americans working alongside white colleagues. Immigrants and the disabled contributing on equal terms. Ordinary citizens uniting in common purpose. It was messy, chaotic, and profoundly human, and it achieved the impossible. Every bomber that rolled out of Willow Run was more than a weapon. It was proof that strength lies not in rigid purity, but in diversity, freedom, and cooperation. The lesson that echoes. On March 17, 1943, the truth arrived in Berlin on a single sheet of paper, and no one in power would listen. That refusal to face reality doomed the Third Reich. But the lesson stretches far beyond World War II. The most formidable walls are not those of concrete or stone, but those we build in our minds, walls of prejudice, arrogance, or denial. Facts may be cold, but they are relentless. In the end, fantasy can inspire armies, but only truth can sustain them. And so the legacy of Willow Run is not just the story of bombers and factories. It is the story of how free people, united across their differences, can wield a power greater than any dictator's dream, the power to change the course of history.